Talk to Albert Breer right now. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Hey, guys. What's up? It's been an eventful week for you guys, I'm sure.
It's been pretty interesting on college football, pro football, like you name it. On every front, it's been a crazy week or two here in Seattle. And yesterday we got, I don't know, a bunch, 6, 7 names that could be in play here for the Seahawks. Now, these are just the coordinators, right, that they're thinking of interviewing. But based on what we've heard so far, does anybody jump out to you as being a good fit here in Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one, right? Like, which is Dan Quinn. And I feel like I've been writing this for 2 months now. I didn't think, go back 2 or 3 weeks, like a lot of the context on this was that Pete might retire. And I don't think like anybody had quite the idea that this could go the other way, where it's actually Jody making the decision and not Pete. But, like through that whole thought process and people out there saying like, yeah, like there's a possibility that the Seahawks have a new coach in 2024, regardless of how it happens. Dan Quinn was the number one name, and I think it'll continue to be the number one name. I just think, DQ sort of waited for the right opportunity, and he's had chances over the last couple of years to leave, and he just hasn't thought this shot or that shot was right. And I think Seattle lines up as sort of perfect for him. And I think in a lot of ways he's perfect for what Seattle needs right now. Now, I know a lot of people be focused on the fact that he doesn't coach offense, he doesn't coach quarterbacks, and that's something we can get to. But I think in a lot of other ways, DQ is exactly what the Seahawks would be looking for in a lot of different ways.
Greatest strength and greatest weakness that Dan would bring if that is announced, let's say, this week.
The strength, I think, Brock, is the ability to unify people and create a culture and get the most out of every player who plays for him. I've talked to Micah Parsons a few times about playing for him. And remember, the defense that DQ ran, in Seattle was like the traditional Pete Carroll cover 3. And, Micah is the sort of player where if you use him in just a single way, you're not going to get the most out of him, right? He's such a unicorn in that he can play off-ball linebacker, he can play on the line, he can rush, he can blitz, he can cover, he can do everything you want him to do. So using a player like that in just one way is sort of wasting him. And so in a lot of ways, like when Dan got his hands on Micah, it on paper didn't look like the greatest fit in the world. And Dan's defense changed, and he adjusted, and they're doing things a lot differently there now than he did them in Seattle all those years ago. So, I think it's a great example of getting the most out of somebody. And Micah would tell you himself how much he loves playing for DQ. And then you see the ascension of other players there, right? Like what Trayvon Diggs has become under Dan Quinn, what Deron Bland did this year under Dan Quinn after Diggs got hurt. Stephon Gilmore's career had a little bit of a renaissance this year with Dan Quinn as his defensive coordinator. I mean, right on down the line, he maximizes players. And I think that's as great a compliment as you can give a coach. So I say that's a strength. The weakness, of course, would be, all right, obviously quarterback's going to be a big topic of conversation in Seattle over the next year or two. And that's not his area of expertise. But he's so well connected in the coaching community that I do think he'd find good people to take care of that part of it for him.
To follow Pete Carroll, I would think you've got to have some level of juice. I mean, the one thing Pete brought was instant credibility. How does Dan relate compared to maybe some other names that could be available on the juice meter?
I mean, he's in a lot, like he's his own guy, but I think one of the things I've said this to a couple of people there over the last few days since Pete was let go. And Brock, you might be able to relate with this. What they had in that building was really unique, and I always look forward to going to the Seahawks facility because it was a different feel. And it's it's hard to describe it, but you know it when you see it and you know it when you're around it. And, I think that's, one of the greatest strengths Pete has was being able to create a certain culture and an atmosphere in that building. And that's why I think DQ is like a really good fit because he gives you the ability to maintain and build on that, and I think if you're going to pull away from it, you kind of pull away from what your identity has been the last 14 years and you walk away from something that I think is really special about that place. And I've talked to Gino about this. Like, Gino said that's part of the reason why he kept signing one-year contracts to come back, is that he liked being there so much. So, like, I do think, like, you know, and look, like, there's some things with Pete, like, where, you know, they needed updating, and you know, as he's gotten older, obviously, I think it's a little harder and everything else, but I still think there's a lot of good that he left behind. And, you know, I think, you know, if you go with DQ, it gives you the ability, and to answer your question on the juice meter, it gives you the ability to build, to maintain and then build on what Pete brought from a juice standpoint.
Breer here with us. If Dan Quinn is the most obvious, I think Jim Harbaugh would be the most outrageous. Does he interview?
Yeah. I sort of, you know, like, I'm looking at this right now, Brock, and if I'm the Seahawks, I make the call. Yes. You know, and look, it's a little funny because obviously he was a big rival of theirs, and he and Pete were at odds both in college and the pros at several points. But I think Jim brings something very unique in his own right, you know, and that, like, it looks exactly the same everywhere he goes. Like, Stanford looked like the Niners, looked like Michigan. They all look the same, right? And it's a unique kind of, in this day and age, way of building it, but it's worked everywhere. I think in a lot of ways, and, you know, Mike, you're around my age and grew up in the area I grew up in. It's a lot like Parcells. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, he's the guy who can come in. He's going to shake your program up. He's going to be able to get results right away. He's going to get the most out of your team. You know, and then 3 or 4 years down the line, he's probably going to have burned everybody out, and so you're probably not signing up for a decade of the guy. You know what I mean? But if I were the Seahawks, I would definitely take a look at it and going through the process. And at any rate, guys, like, the Seahawks haven't done this in 14 years. I think it would be a great information gathering exercise for the Seahawks. You know, I think that's part of it. Like, when you're going through something like this, is you got the ability to information gather from other programs around the sport. And you know, if I were, you know, Jody Allen, you know, and John Schneider, the chance to sort of look under the hood a little bit and how Jim Harbaugh does things wouldn't be a bad experience.
How about Mike Vrabel?
Yeah, it's another one. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm saying yes, but there's, like, a lot of good names out there, you know, and Vrabel's another one where I put Vrabel more in the category of, you know, DeMeco Ryans, Dan Campbell. I think what the Patriots hope, you know, Gerard Mayo will be now, Kevin O'Connell. You know, look, I think one of the things with Vrabel that's so interesting is, you know, you're going to get player engagement right away, right? And in an era when it's harder to get that than ever before, like, it's really, really hard because of how kids come up you know, in this day and age, it's not automatic. This isn't like we were, which is like we did things because our coaches told us to. You know, you have to pursue and get that engagement. Vrabel has it when he walks through the door because of the skins he has in the wall. And then, you know, Vrabel brings to you, I think, a lot of elements of what New England was when he was there, which is he can coach, you know, all 3 phases of the game. He's excellent situationally. He's going to weaponize your players and get him to understand the rules and how to use them in the game. And he's going to be able to attract good coaches there. So I'd say Vrabel, like, if you want to look at, like, what DeMeco has done in Houston, what Vrabel himself did over his first couple of years in Tennessee, and then what Dan Campbell has done in Detroit, that'd sort of be what you were buying.
Well, I want that. That sounds great. I mean, like, when I hear that, and it's not a shot at Dan Quinn, but when I hear that sounds like fantastic. Whereas Dan Quinn feels a little, I don't know, like, if you were going to have Dan Quinn, maybe just keep Pete.
So here's the thing, Mike. I like, obviously, I think there's some parallels between where New England is right now and where Seattle is, right? Like, and having had one coach for a long period of time. I think there's a reason why most teams that have dynastic periods or periods of sustained success like those franchises have, there's a reason why they usually go to a guy who's from the family.
Does it usually work,
right?
though?
Like, and I mean, George Seifert did, right? Like, in
short term,
and I'd say, like, I mean, Barry Switzer didn't work long term, but they did win a Super Bowl, and it was sort of the idea. The idea in hiring Jimmy was the same in the idea in hiring Switzer. Now, I don't think Switzer was nearly as smart as Jimmy, but he did get results at the beginning. I think the reason why is because you see so many of these franchises that bumble around and are flipping their identity every 2 or 3 years, right? That's 75% of the NFL is franchises that, like, every 2 or 3 years are remaking themselves. There's a new culture. There's new this coming in, right? and they're just sort of wandering around in the wilderness. If you've spent 14 years, like the Seahawks have, building a certain program, a certain culture, don't you want to give at least one more run at keeping that going before you go out into the wilderness with most of the other NFL teams and trying to seek that? I think that's sort of why, And look, I think if you come across something really, really special, then you can pull the plug. Like Pittsburgh in 2007 is a great example. Everybody thought going into that hiring cycle, when Cowher walked away, that it was going to go to Ken Wisenhunt or Russ Grimm. But they had a real process. It was a legitimate process, and they wind up finding Mike Tomlin in the process. And it's not like Ken Wisenhunt would have been a horrible hire. He got to a Super Bowl a couple of years later with Arizona, but they actually went through a real process. So if I'm the Seahawks, I look at this and say, Dan Quinn's my number one because he's going to give us a chance to at least take one run at continuing what Pete built here over the last 14 years, and we don't want to walk away from our identity. But I want to be open-minded enough. So if I bump into something really, really special, and maybe that's Vrabel, then I'm going to be flexible enough to pivot and do that.
I know you got to be around your phone because news could break any day here with what we watched in Philadelphia in the implosion, what happened in Dallas over the weekend. Do you anticipate those jobs also being available? And if so, where then does the Seahawks job, from just a priority or people looking at it from afar, where would it rank in what, 7 openings right now and maybe a couple more?
Yeah, it's 8, and that Philly and Dallas could be 9 and 10, which is wild. But
a third of the league.
I would say, I would say like Dallas. I think is going to Dallas. My anticipation, Brock, is that Jerry's going to take a couple of days here and really kind of think this through. And, I think you can say two things at once, which is Mike McCarthy doesn't really deserve to be fired. He's won 12 games 3 years in a row. They've ranked first, third, and first. It's points scored over those 3 years. And yet, you can understand why he'd act with some urgency at 82 years old with the roster he has and the playoff performance the last few years. So I think that's something he's really thinking about. And Philly, I just say this, I don't think Jeffrey Lurie's panicky as an owner, but I do know that he acts on instinct, and his instinct's been right a lot. Where he knew when it was time to move on from Doug Peterson, he knew when it was time to move on from Chip Kelly, and he knew, what his teams needed when he did make those moves. So that's what makes this one unpredictable. Again, Nick Sirianni does not deserve to be fired, no matter how the season ended. He was in the Super Bowl a year ago. They were 10-1 2 months ago. But I can't predict what Jeffrey Lurie's instinct is going to tell him to do in this situation, because his instincts have served him pretty well. As for where the Seahawks job ranks, I think it's right there, maybe behind the Chargers, because the Chargers have Justin Herbert. But with the young nucleus they have, you can certainly look and say, they just had 2 monster draft classes. There's a real foundation to build on there. Your facilities are top notch, obviously. And if you like Geno, and you think Geno can kind of be the guy to tread water with over the next year or two, give you a little time to find one, then the Seahawks could be in real contention. I'm not just talking making the playoffs, real contention pretty soon.
Well, talking to Albert Breer here from Monday Morning Quarterback, and he's just fantastic at this stuff. You're a perfect person to sort of talk names with. I love this. All your connections in the league and all your opinions and all
this
that
is you
stuff.
at the winter meetings, man. This
I
is
love
right.
it.
You love
this is what Albert's great at. This is why I've been excited to talk to him about all this. One of the debates here has just been the offense versus defense thing, and you brought it up early. Most of the league is going towards hot shots, smart offensive coordinators. The Seahawks, we have 7 or 8 names. All but 2 of them so far are on the defensive side, and the 2 offensive guys are Mike Kafka and Frank Smith, neither of whom are huge names, et cetera. So it was suggested to me the other day that the reason to go with an offensive guy, Brady Henderson, our friend here from ESPN.com, is because if you hire a defensive guy, then they hire a good offensive coordinator, which you need to survive in today's NFL. If he's good, he's just going to get hired away, and then you need to hire another good offensive coordinator, so that maybe in this league it makes more sense to stay with offense. What do you make of all that?
The looming Bobby Slowick problem in Houston, right?
Yep.
Like where C.J. Stroud has played phenomenal, and he may have played his coach off his staff, right? Where it's a lot of teams would rightfully look at Bobby Slowick now and say, okay, that's a guy we're looking at, that comes from that Shanahan-McVay tree. I'm not downplaying the importance of having a good offensive play caller or a good guy to work with your quarterbacks. And I think it is a huge advantage that, LA and San Francisco have, and McVay and Shanahan. I just think it can't be the number one thing. I'm going to tell you guys a weird story. I've actually relayed this to some NFL coaches too, but what really got my attention this fall was Deion at Colorado, and watching some of the meetings and the stuff out on the field that he had early in the year before they fell apart. And just looking at the eyes of the players and how locked in they were on Deion, right? And how they hung on every word. Mm-hmm. And, I thought about my kids playing tackle for the first time. So I coached a third grade team, and it made me think about how impossible it is to get those kids to pay attention to anything at once at all. And we only had 13 of them. You know what I mean? So I was like, I remember watching the Deion thing, and I'm like, that's freaking amazing that those kids are so locked into everything that he's saying. This generation, it's hard to get that. And so, I say that because I do think, if I had to rank Sean McVay's strengths, I think play calling and working with the quarterback might not be in the top 5. He is so good at getting that engagement. And that's what the ex-players give you. You know what I mean? That's what Mike Vrabel gives you. That's what D'Amico Ryans gives you. That's what Dan Campbell gives you. And you remember having this discussion with Mike McDaniel, and I remember him saying to me, I have to be the smartest guy in the room to have a chance. And you see how creative he has to be to get the engagement, right? Yeah. So I just think the leadership piece of it often gets overlooked because you can farm out the offensive stuff, right? You cannot farm out the leadership if you're a head coach. And I think, Brock, you can probably relate with this, but if you don't have that leadership part, then it doesn't matter how good a job you do drawing up an offense or coaching a quarterback. In fact, I think in a lot of ways, that's what went wrong with all the Patriot guys. All those guys were great with the X's and O's. Patricia, Flores, McDaniels. I mean, all of them were awesome with the X's and O's. And they all took the attitude, well, I'm going to give the guys the answers to the test, and they're just going to buy in. And it didn't happen. Well, why is that? Because they didn't sell it right. Because they didn't lead right. And so
isn't Philadelphia the ultimate of that right in front of our eyes last night? 10-1, unbelievable roster, all this innovation, all this great stuff they do, but those guys just didn't play. I had one former player say it was such a here, let me read his exact line. Last night was offensive to the game of football.
Yeah.
It was offensive to the game. These guys just shut it down.
Game too. Brock, that was a playoff game.
That's right.
And then take it a week later. Go back and look. Go back and watch some of the highlights of Titans Jaguars, and tell me if there was a single guy out there who quit on Mike Vrabel. Seriously.
Yeah.
And this was a meaningless game at the end of the year against a team that was trying to win the division. Jacksonville, they win that game, they win the division, right? And the Titans are coming in. This is a bunch of guys who've been in the playoffs the last few years. And, they're on a downturn.
Bert, you got to stop.
Yeah, you're selling me on Vrabel real hard, man.
Bert, you got to just stop.
I really like the way they've played in Tennessee the last few years. I don't know. All right, let me ask you 2 off-the-wall questions, or 2 sort of different types of questions before we let you go. One, name that Brock brought up a few months ago that I've never quite been able to shake, and we haven't heard his name really at all throughout this process, but I don't know that we would because he's not an NFL coordinator. How about Lincoln Riley?
I think Lincoln Riley is very open to going to the NFL. I think he's very open to it. And he makes some sense, absolutely. Now, I think the biggest question with him would be, okay, who are you bringing staff-wise? Because that's been a problem even at the college level, right? But as far as being able to evaluate talent, which he's done, and you have to do it at the college level, being able to kind of meld people together on the fly. It didn't work out this year, but last year they were able to win with a bunch of transfers. And being able to win consistently, I think all of that's there. Now, again, I think whether or not he succeeds in the NFL would ride heavily on who he's planning on bringing in as staff. But I don't think it's a bad idea at all, especially at a time when it seems like the pipeline of offensive coaches is running a little bit dry just because there have been so many guys hired on that side of the ball over the last few years.
All right, here's my last thing for you. Where does Russell Wilson play football next year?
Ooh.
That's a great question. I think he has the Carson Wentz, Tim Tebow problem, guys. You
It's
know,
not a good.
like
That
where
doesn't
he
sound. I
can't-
don't know what that problem is, but it doesn't
But-
sound
but
like a
you-
problem I want to have.
The problem is so that problem is, and by the way, it's a Cam Newton problem too, right? Like, so not all like players who just completely sucked at the end, but I think with those guys, it's hard to envision those guys as a backup because they're a celebrity quarterback, right? And even as like a bridge, like let's say you're the Bears, right? And you're trading Justin Fields, and it's like, okay, we want to go find a bridge to Caleb Williams. Do you want Russell to be that guy?
No.
Right? Or would you rather have somebody who's like a little more anonymous being that guy, right? Yeah. Like, do you want, like, and I think that's the problem he has, is like I don't know that he's been good enough for somebody to flat out give him the job. I don't know that he's been good enough for somebody to say, yes, he is our quarterback. We're giving him the job. And then the next level down from that, like, it's hard to find a fit for him as a backup. And even as a bridge, like, I don't know that he's the guy that you want around your young quarterback. So I think that's sort of the problem for Russell. If you ask me where he's playing next year, I guess it's not impossible that he's out of the league, although I don't want to say that. So I would say like a team that's drafting in the middle of the first round that may be out of range for a quarterback that like just a tad out of the range of a quarterback they might want to draft. So give me like, I don't know, the Raiders. How about the Falcons with Bill Belichick? That'd be fun, right?
That would be bizarre, but not impossible either. I think those are actually some pretty good answers. Bert, as our texter here says, Bert is money today. Totally agree.
Yep.
25 minutes of tons of great stuff, really good information, opinion, the whole thing. And now you got me really excited about Mike Vrabel, so probably won't.
And all I want to know is, how did fishing camp go?
Yeah.
I mean, that's all I want to know.
Are we doing fishing camp again for your son next year?
We are doing fishing camp again.
Nice.
Yeah, I believe my wife signed up. The problem is you got to sign up for these things in like November, December
I know.
now.
Yeah.
And then you get to the summer, and all of a sudden you find out that you've like double booked them for half the summer, right?
Yeah.
So
no ice fishing camp though. We're not doing that for like February vacation, are we?
No.
They'll take your money and they'll take it early. No, we're going skiing, but we are going to Lake Placid this
look at
weekend
you.
for a hockey tournament. Yeah, I'm driving. I believe I'm going to be driving straight from Lake Placid to Buffalo for the playoffs. So
wow. Very exciting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good luck
hopefully
with
the
that.
weather holds up okay.
All right. Let me tell you, I'm not going to talk to you during that time. I don't want any part of you being on the phone with us during that, but we appreciate your time
Thank you,
today.
Bert.
Thanks, man. We'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Have
All
a
right,
good
there
one.
you go. I love Bert. You can read him at Monday Morning Quarterback. You can read him on Twitter, Albert Breer, etc. He does just such a phenomenal job. And there's a lot to react to in there. Can we do that next, Brock? Can we react to some of those names?